Welcome to your lecture on ancient Greece. I know many of you are familiar with Greece as you spent a huge amount of time on Greece in middle school. However, what we're going to focus on is specifically the art and architecture and the philosophy of Greece. However, this lecture is really focusing on Key Concept 2.2, which is more of our political key concepts. So you will study the Greek architecture in another lecture. Key Concept 2.2 is all about the development of states and empires, which, believe it or not, Greece was neither a state nor an empire. It was the Greek people were a series of city-states, and we're going to go through several of those. Roman numeral I for the College Board states that the number and size of imperial societies grew dramatically by imposing political unity on areas where previously there had been competing states. Now, this is one of the reasons why the Greeks as a whole is not a specific state. If you remember your Greek history, you will recall many battles between the different city-states, that there was never a lot of peace or unity amongst the different city-states that all called themselves Greeks. So what made them Greek was really their culture and their language. However, the AP wants to make sure that you can identify Phoenician and Greek colonization in the Hellenistic world. So if you move to the next slide, you'll see a map of the Phoenician and Greek colonies. So here you're looking at both the Greek and the Phoenician colonies. The Greek colonies are in green, and then your Phoenician are in blue. Now, Phoenicia started out as a Greek colony, but as it is true with any colonization process, they develop their own cultural tendencies, they mix with the native people, and they're going to expand out in their own way. So we also are going to be looking at Carthage. If you can go ahead and find Carthage on this map, you'll see it in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. The Carthaginians are going to be a super powerful Greek or Phoenician colony later on in the time period. Proper Greece is what we call this area around Thrace, the Balkan Peninsula. Obviously, your most important cities are going to be Athens and Sparta. Athens and Sparta are going to be constantly warring throughout this time period, and eventually Athens will kind of win out. Another thing to note is this area around the Black Sea. So you can see that the Greek colonies went up into Byzantium and in up to the Crimea, and along the eastern coast of the Black Sea as well. Now, this is eventually going to play into what will become the Byzantine Empire after the fall of Rome. Byzantium, this city here, is eventually going to be Constantinople. And Constantinople is a city that we will discuss throughout this course constantly. It's a very important city for this course. The Phoenicians had a series of city-states, some of the main ones you can see listed here, and of course they're going to expand throughout the Mediterranean, and they did fight with the Greeks quite often. So even though the Phoenicians started out as as a Greek colony, they end up becoming powerful traders. Basically, one of the things that's important about the Phoenicians is the fact that they figured out how to do a purple dye. That purple dye comes from snails that are found in the Mediterranean area, and they're going to obviously create these colors that are going to be important for royalty throughout all of history. And that's the key to the Phoenician power and the Phoenician money, that they will end up controlling a huge amount of the Mediterranean Sea. The other important part about the Phoenicians is the alphabet. Obviously, this will become our alphabet in the modern day. You can see it listed here. So it's a little bit different from the pictograms or the cuneiform of the previous time period. Here we start to get figures that are going to represent sound rather than words. And this is something that's new for the development of written language. Up to this point, all of our written languages had some type of pictorial representation of a word or an idea. Here, what the Phoenicians are going to do is revolutionize writing by starting to create characters that represent the sounds that we speak, so that we can create a phonetic alphabet that obviously we still use today. You can see the Hellenistic world here, and basically what will become, the Greeks are going to be taken out by the Romans, obviously, and then you have your Hellenistic world that Alexander the Great's going to create. Now, Alexander the Great is obviously kind of our last Greek. He wasn't actually Greek, but he manages to conquer a huge amount of land, and he will create the largest land empire to date in this course. Obviously, we get some larger empires later on. You can see the area that he's conquering all throughout the Mediterranean area. This is at the end of his reign after his death, and you can see how the different areas are going to be split up into different types of empires. Now, we will look specifically at Alexandria because it becomes a super important cultural hub for the ancient world and really preserves a huge amount of the Greek culture that you guys know about. Carthage, like I said, was a super important Phoenician colony that developed its own trade empire throughout the Mediterranean. The settlers, the Phoenician settlers, mixed with the native Berbers and created their own population, which historians have called the Carthaginian or the Punic culture, because they developed their own Punic language. It's a mix between a Greek and African, basically Bantu language. Carthage is in modern-day Tunisia. It's on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. The government system that Aristotle wrote about for Carthage was one of the most democratic in the Mediterranean world during this time period. However, when the Romans sacked Carthage, in the Third Punic Wars, we lose a huge amount of records. And so what exactly the Carthaginians did with their government system, what exactly their religion was, is a little bit confusing, because what the Romans wrote about Carthage is all negative, including things like children's sacrifices and their religion. And there's a lot of stuff, bias associated with the history of Carthage. And there's things that are just unknown, simply because of what the Romans do to the city when they finally take it out. So now we need to move on to the actual Greeks. So we're going to focus on the Athenians, as that's what the College Board wants you to focus on. So I want to talk about two Bronze Age civilizations, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. So if you can find Mycenae on this map, let's see it here. Mycenae is one of the archaeological finds that gives us a huge amount of information about the Greeks in the Bronze Age. The problem is we don't have any writing. There's nothing, the writing hasn't been deciphered, so there's no way to know the history of the Mycenaeans. So what we know about the Bronze Age Greek city-states, it comes from Homer, but Homer was writing during the classical age. He was writing thousands of years after the fall of these Bronze Age empires. So we don't know if the Trojan War actually happened. We don't know if the things that Homer wrote about for these what the Greeks write about in their history actually happened. But what we do know is that there was an oral history throughout the Greek city-states. So some of the stuff must be true. They are going to develop the Greek city form with that hilltop on the top, that's going to have the citadel that we eventually call the Acropolis during the classical age, and of course your palaces and things like that. So we have a lot of archaeological findings from the Mycenaeans. The Minoans were another city-state that has been an archaeological treasure trove for us to know about the Bronze Age Greeks. Now, they were destroyed in 1450 BCE, possibly by the Mycenaeans themselves. Here's some more of the findings at Mycenae. This is actually the gate to Mycenae, and you can see that there's lions on the gate. What's the significance of that is the fact that the Greeks obviously had to have had access to Africa. You don't really see lions wandering around the hilltops of Greece. So they must have had access to Africa. They must have been there to know that these animals existed. One of the ways that they got water was to build these cisterns down into the mountaintop. The The Mycenaeans all of the Greek city-states were on these massively huge mountaintops. They did not build in the valleys at all. And so the difficult part of getting water was they'd have to dig down into the mountainside. Here you can actually see through the wall of the city of Mycenae, and what you're looking at is the treetops, because the city itself was actually so high up in the mountainside. To the right of this, you'll see the Mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon obviously is a character associated with Homer in the Iliad. He was a king. He was associated with some of the wars of the Bronze Age. And again, we're not really sure about any of that. Now, this mask is actually made out of bronze, and it does not date correctly to go with King Agamemnon. However, the Greek Museum actually still labels it as a Mask of Agamemnon, even though its dates does not match up with what Homer was writing about. So our Bronze Age civilizations, if you remember, have fallen. The Hittites in Syria were invaded. The Egyptians are basically ruling. The Mycenaeans are going to fall due to internal stuff, we think. And all the trade routes shut down. And so what we end up with in the Mediterranean region is a dark age, which is why we lose information about these Bronze Age civilizations like the Mycenaeans or the Minoans or the Delphi or any of these major Greek Bronze Age civilizations. We just lose that information because we go into a dark age. However, when we go into our next time period, we get the classical age of Greece. So these are your classical age city-states. Obviously things like Athens and Sparta, but you're also going to have Corinth and some of the major cities that are going to be important to biblical studies. So obviously all the Greek city-states are on mountains. They're all separated out because they're obviously an island nation. They're around the Aegean and the Black Sea. The biggest issue is that they don't have irrigation systems because they have seawater. So it's difficult to grow anything. However, eventually the Greeks will figure out olives and of course grapes. Those two products are going to be very important to Greek history because obviously you have olives associated with olive oils and everything else that's associated with olives. And then of course you have your grapes, which of course is wine. There's not a lot of natural resources in the region. There's no place to graze cattle or anything else. So these two products of olives and grapes are going to be super important to Greece. Okay, so Greece was organized into city-states, which we call the polis. The polis will develop because of population growth. As with all of the empires that we study within the classical age, after we go through this tiny dark age between the Bronze Age, the fall of these Bronze Age empires, into what we're calling the classical age, we see an increase in population. And as a result of that, we're going to develop massive cities. Each Greek city had the same structure. You had an acropolis at the top with the agora, which is your marketplace around the acropolis. All of the cities were organized into social classes that were different. It wasn't an economic social class, and this is something that's different about Greece. And when we talk about the Greek philosophies, you'll see why. There were citizens who had political rights, and then the citizens with non-political rights. So women and children and slaves were the people who had no political rights, and then all of the men would have political rights. Now, each city-state developed their own government system on how those with political rights would run the city. So every single city-state was different. Again, we're only going to be talking about Athens. Militarily, obviously the Greeks were fantastic at military. Most of you guys have seen 300. And so you know about the hoplite soldiers. So what the Greeks did was they didn't have a standing army, but all of the Greek citizens were farmers, which means they're super strong. And they were well trained. All of the men were trained in the battlefield. So the men would go off, go fight the Persians, go fight different city-states, whatever, throughout history. And the Greeks were the first ones to come up with this idea of military formations. In this case, it's the phalanx with the shield that would cover two people. And that is going to be massively important when they're going up against the Persians with their compound bow. The Persians are going to get a hold of the compound bow through trade throughout with Asia, And so the Greeks are going to be able to combat that with their military formation. Again, we've talked about the Greek colonies, but here's a map of them again. You can see that they're all throughout the Mediterranean world. They did actually get a colony all the way up into modern-day Great Britain, throughout the Black Sea, into what will become the Roman Empire, all along the Spanish corridor as well, and of course northern Africa. So this is going to spread the Greek culture. This is why we see so much art that is Greek. And we see, obviously we're going to see the spread of eventually the Phoenician alphabet and everything else into this region as well. And as a result of this, you get a new wealthy class. What does that wealthy class want to do? Well, obviously they want to control politics. And so we enter into this time period where the Greek city-states were being ruled by what was called tyrants. The tyrants were these newly rich people from colonization, and they took power from the old aristocrats, and they would pay their army. Now, this is something that's new for the Greeks, because previously it was all about defending the city-state. Well, with the rise of the tyrants, we now see the idea of not just being offensive, but also being, not just being defensive, but also being offensive. So in other words, they create their own military that are part military, but also their own personal bodyguards. And as a result of that, people didn't like it. And so it goes against Greek philosophy, it goes against Greek ideals. And so eventually we develop the idea of democracy, or the oligarchs. So we're looking at cities, specific cities that imperial societies displayed unique social and economic dimensions, and we're going to be talking about specifically Athens and Alexandria. We've already talked about Carthage, and we will talk about these other cities with each of the different empires as we go. So talking about Athens, it started out as an oligarchy, which means ruled by the few. So a bunch of aristocrats got together. However, when there was an economic depression, the aristocrats started infighting, and you end up with a civil war. You end up with a guy named Solon, who takes full power in 594 BCE. He cancels all debts and freed everybody. Well, that's not going to make anybody happy, except for the newly freed people. The aristocrats are upset that they are not getting their debt taken care of, so it just led to more fighting. So we have more fighting, which leads into Pisistratus coming into power in 560 BCE. He increases trade, and he gives land to the poor. The aristocrats rebelled because they didn't like that the poor were given land, because at this point in time, land equals wealth, land equals title, land equals aristocracy. So the aristocrats did not want the poor to have any land. Now, they didn't mind the increase in trade, because what Pisistratus was trying to do was to recover the economy, but it doesn't work. Eventually, a guy named Pericles takes power, and what he does is he creates democracy. He creates a two-house legislative assembly with the Council of 500 and the Assembly. The Council of 500 was basically your elders, the aristocrats. They controlled foreign affairs, they controlled the treasury, they proposed laws. The Assembly was made up of all men within the city, all men with political rights. And they would take the proposed laws from the Council of 500, debate them, and pass those laws. So what he does is he creates two branches of power that is very similar to the system that we have today. And he has made both the aristocrats happy with this Council of 500, and he's also made the majority of the people happy with the Assembly. Most of what Pericles did was created a direct democracy where all the citizens were voting. Remember that you were a Greek citizen of the city-state of Athens if you were a male. The Assembly, like I said, would pass laws. They dealt with war. Poor citizens could participate in government through the Assembly system. The problem is, and then what he did was he separated powers through these generals, and the generals were in charge of kind of the everyday running of the city. Now, if you were a bad person, or if you broke a law, what you would do is basically go through this system called ostracism, where everybody would vote you out of the city. So it's just like Survivor. So if you broke a law, you would go in front of the citizens of the city, and they would vote whether you could stay or whether you needed to go. As a result of the age of Pericles, we have a time of peace. And this is where Athens becomes the center of Greek culture. New art forms, because it's a peaceful time, they rebuild the city, and Athens becomes super important. Now, obviously, there are competing Greek city-states who don't like that Athens is becoming so rich, so powerful, and new, and things are going really well for them. And that will spark what's called the Peloponnesian War. Basically, the Peloponnesian War was created because of dealing with the Persians. So when the Persians were trying to take over Greek city-states, all of the Greek city-states combined into an alliance called the Delian League. The Delian League was led by Athens. The Greeks were obviously successful against the Persians, which you guys know, and the Athenians, but however the Delian League, because it was led by the Athenians, people started to get upset that the Athenians had too much power within the Mediterranean area. And that's going to lead to the internal Peloponnesian War. The Peloponnesian War was a war between Athens and Sparta. Basically, the Athenians were no match for the Spartan army. The Spartan army is amazing. The Spartan army is fantastic. The Athenians just couldn't deal with them. So the Athenians actually kind of ran and hid in the Acropolis. Unfortunately, disease broke out and killed off a bunch of the Athenians, including Pericles. So now they've lost their leader as well. Obviously, Sparta's going to do well in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenian navy was officially defeated in 405 BCE, and Sparta kind of sacked Athens. Like they tore it apart, they burned things down, they completely destroyed it, basically. The results of this is that there's never going to be a Greek empire. The Greek city-states are never going to be able to combine. There's always going to be this intrigue and alliances, and it's like a really good reality TV show. They will never be able to create one big empire. Just to kind of give you some social stuff with Athens, Athens was a very largely populated city. Obviously, the majority of the people that lived in Athens were actually part of the slave class. However, Athens never experienced any type of slave revolt that caused any major problems for them. It was a farming and trade economy. It had to import, like I said, most of its grain because they didn't produce anything but olives and grapes. They had a basic family unit. Women were considered citizens in Athens. They were not considered citizens in most of the other Greek city-states. So if you were a woman in Greece, Athens is the city to be in. They actually had political rights. However, the women always had to be with a male guardian, and women were not given any type of formal education. Hellenistic Greece is what's developed out of what Alexander does. So I want to give you a background on Alexander and what he manages to do when he's creating his empire. Alexander was the son of Philip II, who actually started this. Philip II was a hostage in the city of Thebes, which was a Greek colony, and he learned all the Greek military stuff. So what he does is he goes back to Macedonia when he finally gets out of prison, and he teaches his city, his army, all of the Greek stuff. And so this is going to make them super, super powerful and able to take out anybody. There's two views of Philip. Some people thought of him as a barbarian, as a jerk. He was kind of going over and just conquering. However, some people look at Philip II as a savior because if he had not started, the Greek culture could have disappeared. If he had not basically led to what will become the Hellenistic world after the death of Alexander the Great, we would have lost the Greek culture. They would have destroyed themselves with all the infighting that was going on. Basically, Macedonia took on Athens in 338 BCE, and the Greeks lost. And what Philip II does is he creates the Corinthian League. So Philip II becomes the head of a united Greek city-states. So all of the Greek city-states were combined into this Corinthian League, and they all had to swear an oath of loyalty to Philip II. Each city-state was still self-governing. The League had its own standing army and council, but Philip II again was the head of the League. Philip II controlled the city-states' foreign affairs, so if he needed the Greek army to fight for him, then those Greek city-states had to give up their army. Philip II decided that he wanted to take on Persia, but he was assassinated before the war began. There's all kinds of controversy about his assassination. Some people think that his wife did it. Some people think that his son, Alexander, did it. Some people think that Alexander and his mom had a incestuous relationship, and that's what caused the assassination of Philip II. Some people Persia was one of the leading armies at the time, so some people feel that they were just people that didn't want to take on Persia, and that's why Philip II was killed. Either way, Alexander the Great is going to take over. He was only 20 when he took the throne of Macedonia, and he was also recognized as the head of the Corinthian League. He invades Persia, successful. He goes into all the Greek areas of Southwest Asia by 333 BCE, so he's managed to take out all of the Greek city-states. Darius III actually walked away from a battle. Darius III was a Persian king at the end of the Persian Empire, and he was being defeated so badly that he literally just ran. Alexander then decides that he's going to take over all the navies within the Mediterranean Sea, and he's very successful. When he shows up in Egypt, the Egyptians surrender without even fighting. He takes the title of Pharaoh, which means that Alexander the Great is now a godlike figure. He will build the city of Alexandria. He leaves very quickly, and then he controls Syria and Palestine by 332 BCE. Darius III tried to keep Persia on the map by negotiating with Alexander, but Alexander said no. He wanted to control the area. So he captured Babylon and a whole bunch of other ancient Mesopotamian cities, and Darius III was eventually killed by his own men. The theory is that people loved Alexander the Great so much and loved his humanity and what he stood for and the ideas of democracy that he was talking as he went through, even though he was emperor, that Darius III's men and the Persians did not even want to fight for it, that they actually wanted to be part of Alexander's world. So now Alexander has taken the title of the King of the Persians. He goes into Asia and gets as far as Pakistan by 326 BCE. His troops basically mutinied in Pakistan and said, we're not going any further. So he goes to Babylon to kind of try to rebuild his army to go further into Asia. He dies on his way back. Some people feel that he could have been assassinated in some way or poisoned. He did fight in all of the battles, so he could have had some type of wound that led to some type of disease. Some people think that he was an alcoholic, and that's what eventually killed him. Some people think that he had some type of sexually transmitted disease that killed him. It's very unclear as to what exactly happened because his body is missing. His body was transported back to Alexandria in Egypt, but it's gone missing. No one's been able to find it. We have no clue where his body is actually buried. Part of history teaches that one of the reasons why his body was missing was because the successors of Alexander didn't want to create this martyred-like figure, this godlike figure. He was already a godlike figure to most of the citizens to whom he had conquered. So people felt like perhaps his tomb could end up as a shrine, and so he went missing. He creates what's called the Hellenistic world, which means to imitate the Greeks. And so what we end up having happen is the Greek language, the Greek culture, the Greek art, the architecture, the math, the science, everything that the Greeks were doing, which was super advanced at the time, just spreads everywhere that Alexander went. Alexandria is probably one of his most important cities that he built. This is obviously on the Mediterranean Sea in Egypt, modern-day Egypt. You can see basically what was set up, what was built by Alexander the Great. It was a trade, political, and cultural center prior to the development of the Roman Empire. Obviously, the Roman Empire will conquer all these cities and repurpose all these cities over the next several hundreds of years. Alexander actually left and the Ptolemy family continued its growth, and the Ptolemy family is actually, you know them because Cleopatra was part of the Ptolemy family. Like I said, it was culture, science, and philosophy. It had a huge museum and library there where all of the Greek classics, the science, the literature, the art, the math, and everything, Euclid, all of those Greek guys whom you have learned about in the past are housed in this library. And so you get these huge scholars from all over the world, from the Greek world, the Jewish world, the Egyptian world. And as a result, Alexandria as a city becomes a city that is developed into zones. So you have the Jewish quarter, you have where the Greeks lived, you have where the Egyptians live. It's still actually set up very similar to that today. Eventually the Romans will take over in 115. Hadrian is the one who sacks Alexandria. We lose a lot of the wonders that were in Alexandria, like the lighthouse and the necropolis and whatnot, to the Roman sacking of the city. I hope you enjoyed this lecture about Greece. If you have any, please make sure that you've written down any questions to ask your teacher during class.